Basics to storytelling. You have a protagonist, and in most cases, an antagonist. The good guys and the bad guys. Someone to root for and someone to root against. In this video, I'm going to talk about villains. In particular, I'm going to discuss a common trend we see whenever a writer wants to develop and add some depth to their villain, and that's the tragic backstory. A typical backstory is a past set of events presented either visually or through dialogue as leading up to the current point in the plot. They can be used in a multitude of ways for various reasons. A tragic backstory is just that, past unfortunate events that one would deem as tragic for the characters that experienced it. It's very often used for the hero in the story, but for now I want to specifically focus on when it's used for the bad guys, when the writer uses their backstory either as a setup in the beginning or as a reveal later on in the movie that tells us of the tragic experience they went through before they were living a life of villainy.
It all began on the day of my actual birth. Both of my parents failed to show up.
In doing research for this video, I've come across two groups of people. One that thinks villains should be treated like the protagonist in that they get significant development, are multi-layered, and we understand them on a deep level. And another that thinks that what seems to be an uptick in trying to either make a sympathetic or ambiguous villain is annoying. That the tragic backstory is just a lazy, manipulative thing the writer slaps onto a villain as cheap development. Whatever happened to characters that are simply evil forces of nature? That we should just let villains be villains. I'll start off by saying I'm not of the belief that the bad guys in stories always need to be really developed or three-dimensional. Some of the most iconic villains of all time exist solely to be evil and to oppose the protagonist, and that's fine, especially with stories geared towards children. Take Cruella de Vil from 101 Dalmatians, for example. Her name literally means cruel devil, and that's what she is.
It's her. It's that devil woman.
She's bought 84 Dalmatian puppies and stole 15 more from her kind, innocent schoolmate Anita with the intention of murdering all 99 of them. The motive behind this?
I live for furs. I worship furs.
That's it. She loves fur coats, so she's going to kill 99 puppies to make one. She's a total maniac, and we don't need to see further development from her to make a better movie. Including a backstory to show how this woman became so vicious and deranged would honestly just be a waste of screen time. Because one, allowing the audience to feel sympathy for her would just do away with the whole devil thing, because that is not how you're supposed to feel about the devil. And two, what possible backstory could have the audience, most of which is made up of young children, thinking, oh, so that's why she's sick enough to murder and skin 99 puppies. No, she's nothing but a cruel individual, and the fact that we see her as only that makes her comeuppance at the end all the more satisfying. Not only can throwing in a tragic backstory for a villain be unnecessary, it can ruin what was already working perfectly. You see it with Hannibal Lecter. The reason a lot of fans hate Hannibal Rising so much is because they ruined what was a terrifying and mysterious villain by shoehorning in a backstory of the Nazis ate my sister, so that's why I'm a cannibal. While that definitely sounds like a very traumatic experience, it's a cheap attempt at adding development to him, and it doesn't even accomplish that because insert tragic backstory here does not automatically make a character or story compelling. There's a quote from The Silence of the Lambs that goes, "Nothing happened to me, Officer Starling. I happened. You can't reduce me to a set of influences." I love that quote. It adds to the creepiness factor and it makes him an enigma. But his backstory from Hannibal Rising does away with all that without adding anything of value. It feels cheap and unnecessary for what was a great villain. That's why I love what they did with the Joker in The Dark Knight.
You wanna know how I got these scars?
At first, he gives us a story of his abusive father sticking a blade in his mouth and carving out that smile. So we think, oh, his tragic backstory is his extremely abusive childhood. But then he gives us another story.
Is it the scars? You wanna know how I got them?
One where he carved his own face just so he can see his wife smile again after her face was disfigured by some loan sharks. The enigma of the Joker is kept. The audience doesn't know which story to believe or even if any of them are true. But we can be left to ponder and imagine for ourselves what the years prior to his assault on Gotham could have possibly looked like. That being said, of course adding depth and development to a villain isn't something writers do for the sake of it. It has a ton of advantages, primarily with making the audience more invested in both character and story. Seeing more dimensions to them or understanding them on a deeper level makes them more believable. And the more believable a character is, the more emotionally invested you are in seeing what happens to them and the story. And tragic backstories definitely aren't the only way to do this. One really simple yet effective way is to give the villain a moment, or many, of kindness. A moment for the antagonist that completely contrasts with what they are usually doing and how we view them. Cersei Lannister gets this all the time with how she feels for and treats her children. We know she's not just some soulless evil being. She's capable of deep love, and it's actually the love and safety of her children that drives a lot of the horrible things she does. It can also be a very small moment, like when Javert from Les Mis pins his medal on Gavroche's dead body. The problem is, when using kindness to add depth to a villain, it can very easily leave the audience thinking, hey, maybe they aren't so bad after all, or not hating the character as much, or not being as scared or intimidated of them as you were before. That is unless this is precisely the writer's goal for the character, as it was with Javert, since that's the moment that signifies the beginning of his change of heart and inner turmoil. So it's fine if the goal is to have the audience walking away feeling some sympathy for the villain. But if that isn't the goal, if they want to maintain the fact that this character is unequivocally a bad person, then giving them a good side probably isn't the way to go. It's why Spielberg ruthlessly subverted this in Schindler's List, when he had us thinking Eamon Goeth, played by Ralph Fiennes, was going to show mercy to a Jewish boy who couldn't clean the stains out of his bathtub.
Go ahead, go on, leave, I pardon you.
Only to kill him as he was leaving. Sometimes there's no room to allow moments like this for the antagonist, because doing so would lessen the impact of their horrific actions. The same can be said for when a villain is given a very vulnerable human moment, but again, it can suffer the same risk of lessening how crooked the character is in the eye of the viewer. So this is where I think the tragic backstory comes into play and where it shines. You can keep the villain just as twisted and have them not stray from that at all, but at the same time also give them significant development by showing or telling the audience about the life experiences that got this character to that point. And as said earlier, character development leads to believability. And to me, nothing makes a villain scarier or more compelling than them feeling real. The reason this trope of showing a villain's origins is so effective in that regard is because it mirrors our real-world experience. People with warped views on the world, truly immoral and wicked individuals, are not born out of thin air. Most of the time, there's a reason they're like that.
Our Billy wasn't born a criminal, Clarice. He was made one through years of systematic abuse.
That's why this makes for one of the most effective ways in developing and adding depth to a villain. While I am going to speak in defense of the tragic backstory, as touched on earlier with Hannibal Lecter, it's not always necessary, and it's not as simple as just revealing past trauma and leaving it at that. If it's going to be used, I think there's more work that needs to be done in order to make it fully effective and compelling. 1. Explaining motive. What a villain stands for obviously tends to run directly against what our hero does, but understanding why a hero is fighting for what they believe isn't difficult. Their values align with ours, and we know more about them than anyone else in the story. It's not the same with villains. It's not as easy to get people to understand why they are in many cases willing to risk everything to accomplish their goal. That is why it is incredibly useful to see the starting point that made them go on to live a life of villainy. Killmonger is easily one of my favorite MCU villains, but he wouldn't be that had we not gotten to see what he experienced as a child. What makes him compelling is that no matter how much the viewer disagrees with what he's doing, we completely understand where he's coming from and why he believes he's right. Compare that with some of the weaker villains in the universe, villains people aren't talking about, and what do they have in common? Their reasoning is either non-existent or not fleshed out, they just exist. However, it's important to note that when using it to explain motive, it has to make sense. Like with Killmonger, the viewer must be able to draw a logical thread from the character's past to where they are now. You can't just say this evil person was bullied as a child, so now they want to destroy the human race. That's disproportionate. They don't match up. The second Saw movie, for example, is a big culprit of this. It's when they reveal a lot of John Kramer's backstory, which is that he had gone in for a routine medical examination when he learned that he was dying of colon cancer with an inoperable brain tumor. He became depressed by this news and drove himself off a cliff. He survived the suicide attempt and subsequently began his life's work of testing others' will to live, which leads to very many people being brutally tortured. Jigsaw is an iconic and memorable horror movie villain, and I guess there is something interesting in the philosophy of a man who takes no pleasure in the suffering of his victims, but is convinced that it's necessary to remind them to be grateful of life. But the way they did it just fell flat for me. Sure, terminal illness can drastically change someone's outlook on life, but still, come on. It's too disproportionate. That's not to say that villains in horror movies ever have an adequate explanation for their actions. The things they do are the most extreme forms of evil, and it's incredibly difficult to have a reasonable explanation of how someone can get to that point. And in defense of Saw, at least it was less of a sob story and more about explaining motive. But my point is just, if you can't completely connect the past with the current actions of the character, then I think you're better off making it a mystery like Michael Myers in the original Halloween, or just pure psychosis. Using the past to explain motive and to develop character can be done a lot better and more believably than that. For example, how it was used with Norman Bates in Psycho. At the end of the movie, a psychiatrist explains that Norman murdered Mrs. Bates and her lover 10 years ago out of extreme jealousy. Unable to bear the guilt, he exhumed her corpse and began to treat it as if she were still alive. He recreated his mother in his own mind as an alternate personality, dressing in her clothes and talking to himself in her voice. This mother personality is jealous and possessive. Whenever Norman feels attracted to a woman, Mother kills her. The psychiatrist says the mother personality has taken permanent hold of Norman's mind. It's elaborated on in Bates Motel, with how incompetent his mother was at dealing with his mental illness and getting him help. It's tragic because he's a victim of his own insanity. That's all it took to fully develop him. It explains the reason for all his killings. It takes us directly into his head and we learn about the cause of his noble descent into deep madness. It's believable, it makes sense, and after this, he's still just as scary, if not more so. And lastly, 2. Explanation or justification. The author has two options. If they do choose to play with the justification side of the tragic backstory, that will only work if the goal is to either A. Make a really sympathetic villain, B. Don't want the villain to be seen as a villain anymore, or C. Open this villain up for intense debate on whether their actions are defensible. All of which can make for a very interesting story or character. But like I said a lot earlier in the video, if what the writer wants for the villain is for them to be seen as undeniably an evil person, this wouldn't work and they only have one other option. It needs to be made clear that it is an explanation, not a justification. Which, in the case of extremely sadistic characters, that goes without saying. But with characters that can very easily be sympathized with to too much of a degree, then the writer needs to go a little further in making it explicitly clear that the tragic backstory doesn't justify their evil ways. Which brings me to the example I'm gonna close off this video with, my favorite Pixar villain, Lotso Hugging Bear. Around halfway through the movie, Chuckles narrates Lotso's tragic backstory for why he is the way that he is, revealing that Lotso and Big Baby once had a beloved owner named Daisy, but were lost during a family trip. When they did find their way back home, Lotso discovered that he had been replaced. This changed his personality and entire view of the human-toy relationship forever. Let's just put ourselves in his shoes for a second. We know that toys in this universe are completely sentient beings with real emotions, and their primary need is to be loved, cared for, and played with. They are pretty much children to these children. So Lotso, making the long journey back home only to find that his owner had already replaced him and seems perfectly happy without him, makes for a very tragic backstory. It's understandable why that would harden his soul like that, totally warp how he feels about the humans, and why he would have such deep resentment for any toy that still believes they're loved by their owners. They have completely developed him and given us a great reason for why he believes toys are just trash meant to be thrown away. But for as sad and tragic as his backstory is, it doesn't in any way lessen how much of an evil, sadistic being the toy is. That is because we are reminded of that fact time and time again, and it is impossible to use his backstory as a justification for the things he does. Woody even explicitly says this by pointing out that whatever false feelings of abandonment he has does not justify him lying to Big Baby, making him feel like he was abandoned too, and it doesn't justify how he treats others. And if all the things Lotso had done up to that point wasn't enough to show us how evil he was, if some were still rooting for him to turn back to the cuddly toy he once was, the writers then have Andy's toys go out of their way to save Lotso's life, and they have Lotso repay them by trapping them in what might be Pixar's darkest scene ever, the scene where Andy's toys are very close to being incinerated. They stress the fact that Lotso, despite his backstory, is immensely evil and irredeemable, so we stay hating him, stay rooting against him, and when he does get his comeuppance, we don't feel bad for him, we're relieved. So I guess my point is, including a tragic backstory for the villain, just for the sake of it, is annoying. But it's not the idea that's the problem, it's the use of it. When it's used to the benefit of the villain, and when it's used with an understanding of how it has a leg up on other methods of development, then I do not care if I see it over and over and over again, because it's effective and it works. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments what you think and if there's any particular trope or topic you want to see me cover in the future. Thank you to everyone that subscribed, and if you're new here and are interested in seeing more, then subscribe and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching, bye.